like to begin courses with, or classes, each meeting of a class, with prayer. Usually I use what's called a student's prayer of St. Thomas Aquinas. Maybe some of you have encountered that. And this time I thought it would be nice to do something from Boethius. The Consolation of Philosophy is somewhat famously not explicitly Christian. It's about God in many places, and it has lots of philosophical interests, of course, and also theological ones. But Jesus Christ is never named, for instance, things like that. As we'll talk about even a little bit tonight, Boethius is seen as the author of a number of theological tractates, which do in fact defend the Catholic faith and the Trinity and so on. So he does have documents that prove his Christianity, but in the Consolation, he doesn't specifically refer to Jesus, nor does his presentations of God as a father necessarily differ from other potential Platonic or other Greek kinds of ideas of a father God. But that said, there are some poems in the Consolation that are presented like prayer. And I would like to share one of them. Here we go. I'll share a PDF that I typed up from the Walsh translation. So it's on page 57 if you have that translation handy. This is the final, what is this, 2, 4, 6, 12 lines or so of book 3, song 9. So if you are so inclined, you're welcome to pray this with me, aloud or silently or what have you. And it's a way to think about how Boethius is understanding earthly things and heavenly things. And it's, again, only the final 12 lines of a longer poem prayer. It begins, Father of earth and sky, you steer the world by reason everlasting, and then describes a number of things about God. But I thought it would be nice to have something a little shorter to begin with. And so we can begin with this. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Let my mind rise to your august abode, and there, Lord,
dear Lord,
survey the source
of good.
Then grant that, once I have attained the light, my inward eye I may direct to you. Dispense the fog and the encumbering weight of this earth's bulk, and shine forth clear and bright. For in the eyes of all devoted men, you are calm brightness and the rest of peace. Men aim to see you as their starting point, their guide, conductor, way, and final end. All right, I'll stop that share now and move into some of the introductions that I was thinking we would do today. And as I was looking over different introductory kinds of things that I might say, it occurred to me that really we need to spend even more time than I was initially thinking with the Consolation itself. So we probably will spend some bit of time on the first poem, maybe the first prose section. And if you don't have a copyright in front of you, it'd be easy enough to find a copy online. But that'll give us some sense of Boethius and the Consolation so that we have something to look forward to, if nothing else. But first, I just wanted to note, this is an unusual course for me. This is the first time I've done a course for the Magnus Institute. I'm happy to be here. What I like about this course is no grades, no homework other than the reading, and the whole thing is all the discussion, right? I was a faculty member for an extracurricular honors program for a while that was kind of like this, but we only met once a month and did different readings every month. And so I like that this is going to be a little bit more like a normal course, but without some of the things that get in the way. Oftentimes, some of the grading and the assignments can kind of sometimes distract from the real joys of a good discussion. It's also a little unusual in that it's recorded. I'm not exactly used to being recorded. So some of what we're going to talk about, may or may not be interesting to a larger audience. Hopefully it will be, though. So I am mostly thinking about those of you who are here, like I would be if I were in a classroom, but of course mindful that other people might listen in later on. So I think tonight's kind of like the dramatis personae, the prologue of a play that hopefully the dialogue will be interesting to others, but you are the characters, you're the actors, and you're the ones that sort of matter. So hopefully we'll get to introduce everybody here in a little bit. But because some people might be listening in later, I do want to try to provide some sort of overview for what's going on in this course. and then talk a little bit about my own experience, interests with Boethius, and then turn, like I said, to sort of the actors, where I'd like to see what you have experienced with Boethius or why you're interested in a course on Boethius before coming back around to talking a little bit about the themes of the course, maybe, and again, hopefully spending some good time looking at the first poem and maybe the first prose section so we can get a sense of how we might be reading this text. Because it is a little unusual with the alternating prose and verse, for instance. All right. So who was Boethius? Some of you might have read an introduction to, for instance, the Walsh translation or another translation, or to, I suggested Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has an entry on Boethius that says some things about him. So you might have heard some of these things, but maybe it bears repeating. He was the descendant of a truly Roman, lived in Rome, patrician family, aristocratic family. Apparently he had popes and emperors in his family tree. And he was living, though, after the fall of Rome, born in around the year 480. And so he's living in Rome, a city that's ruled by the conquering Ostrogoths and Visigoths, in this particular case, Theodoric, an Arian, someone who accepts certain aspects of Christian teaching, but rejects the doctrine of the divinity of Jesus Christ. Some people at the time, like I said already, some people not at the time, some people at some times, I think apparently mostly in the 18th century or 19th century, something like that, doubted that Boethius was in fact a Christian, because the Consolation does not specifically refer to Christ. But as Walsh even mentions in the introduction, it seems unanimous, more or less, among scholars now that Boethius was in fact a practicing Catholic Christian. And indeed, he wrote these theological tractates called De Trinitate, Utrum Pater et Filius, Quomodo Substantiae, De Fide Catholica, Contra Judican. Contra Judican is against an Arian heresy, basically. Again, on the Catholic faith, one on the Trinity. So he has these texts as well. And it may, in fact, be the case that these tractates and his Catholic faith in a land ruled by an Arian were part of what led to his ultimate execution, which seems to have happened in 524, which is basically right at 1500 years ago. Last year was the 1500th anniversary of the martyrdom of Boethius. He was, as far as I understand it, immediately revered as a martyr in Pavia, where he was executed. And his body was kept in the cathedral there for some number of years before it was moved to a church called San Pietro in Celdaro, which you can still visit. I've been there. His relics are in the crypt under the relics of St. Augustine of Hippo, who is at the high altar. So it's this nondescript church, kind of out of the way. It's not some big fancy church in Rome or something. It's in a little side city, but near Milan. But it has these great figures there in it. And indeed, it's through that place, Celdoro, that Dante, some 1,000 years later, refers to Boethius in the Paradiso as the soul whose body lies in Celdaro. And so when you walk into the church, they have a plaque with those lines from Dante. And then when you go down into the crypt where Boethius's bones are, they also have a plaque with those lines from Dante that make their church, San Pietro Celdoro, famous. So he was revered as a Saint Severinus Boethius in the church, his feast day being October 23rd, the date of his execution. Again, we just celebrated the 1500th anniversary of that, so it's a big deal. Whenever I introduce students to the Consolation, I want to make sure they want to know a little bit about Boethius's life, particularly the way it ends violently. As you might have seen in an introduction, the Walsh introduction, for instance, mentions this. He was apparently, the way he was executed involved having a belt tightened around his head until his eyes bulged out, and then he was bludgeoned to death. So sorry for that horrible image, but that gives you the kind of sense of the real horror that his life ended with. And sometimes the name Torquatus is included in his long Roman name, Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius. Torquatus, perhaps relating to this idea of the torquing of his death, the way in which he was executed with that belt. So he does have a very horrible end to his life, in that physical sense at least. So he's someone who knows very well fear and doubt and these horrors. He's someone who's imprisoned when he's writing this. And so when he talks about, for instance, in the Consolation, that the imprisonment of the soul is worse than the imprisonment of the body, he knows what he's talking about. He really experienced it. And I think that's important for us to remember. As he points out in that body soul sort of distinction, again, thinking about Dante, I wanted to quote this one little bit of Dante. He says of Boethius that he makes quite plain the world's deceit to one who listens well. So our goal over the next few weeks might be, simply put, as letting Boethius undeceive us, as it were. But some of the things he says are a little surprising. For instance, he says that it's better to be the victim of a crime than the perpetrator of it. That the victim of a crime has the sort of the better end of the deal, because his or her body's harmed usually, but not his or her soul. Whereas when you perpetrate a crime, it's your soul that's harmed, not your body. These sorts of claims are kind of shocking at first. He says at one point that there are no evil men. That's a strange claim. What does that mean? We'll get to these ideas. Um, but I think when he makes some of these strange claims, it's helpful to remember he really did experience evil. He really did experience this exile that he talks about. With all that said, as an introduction to his life, I wanted to say just a few things about where this course is headed. So as you've seen in the outline that's on the website, next week I want to talk about some of the influences on Boethius, particularly Plato, Cicero, Macrobius, St. Augustine, and some biblical passages, particularly ones that pertain to the wisdom books, particularly the ones that refer to Lady Wisdom, because as you'll see, we'll meet a very similar figure in the Consolation. And indeed, sometimes we meet this womanly figure, Lady Philosophy, and in some translations of the Consolation, the translators just go ahead and call her wisdom, not philosophy, in fact, thinking more about that biblical influence. And so then we're going to spend the next 5 weeks after that looking at each book by itself, probably focusing on the themes that I suggested. Why do we need consolation in the first book? And the next book says a lot about fortune and happiness, what false and true happiness are. And then in the next book, book 3 talks a lot about how happiness and the good and God are one and the same, and that we're all actually seeking God, no matter what it looks like we're seeking. And then book 4 is largely about theodicy, or the problem of evil, and providence. And then the final book is mostly about providence and free will. How do those things correspond? How can there be both of them at the same time? These are questions, some of them at least, that Augustine also dealt with and that Boethius knew Augustine dealt with. They're questions that subsequent authors will also think about, even somebody like Milton, or like I said, Dante. And so Boethius is an influence on many people. When it gets to the final week, I want to think about mostly medieval authors and some medievalists of the sort of C.S. Lewis in particular, who called the Consolation of Philosophy one of the top 10 books that most influenced him. But I want to think about Chaucer and Dante. We could also talk a little bit about the Pearl Poet. There are other medieval authors as well. Boethius was one of the most widely read authors in the Middle Ages. Some people say he basically started the Middle Ages, that he's the last ancient or the first medieval. And so his influence is very strong, both in formal ways and in the ideas, the content. And indeed, when we look at these things that influence Boethius or that he influences, I want to think about both of those aspects. The formal qualities. I'm a literary person mostly. I'm not a philosopher per se. And so this text is interesting because it's, of course, called a philosophical text in its title, but it's very literary. It has poems throughout it. And that form is important. And that form influences later dream visions and other genres of medieval poetry. Even the very form of Dante's Commedia, in a certain sense, with his guide figures that lead him through Virgil and so on, are like Lady Philosophy guiding Boethius, for instance. So one of those, as I said in a little post, that really the hope for those readings is not necessarily that you somehow come to understand, Plato's Republic wonderfully by reading one excerpt of it, but just that you can see that Boethius is part of a longer tradition. So now I want to say a few things about my personal experience with Boethius. And I was thinking about a former professor of mine who once said that class discussion is not group therapy. Yes, she's right. That's clearly the case. But at the same time, sometimes we think of academic things as only matters of the head or the mind, the brain, and not, say, the heart or the body. And that's just not the case. We're not disembodied creatures. We're united, a unity of body and soul. And as I mentioned, Boethius is dealing with real fear, real doubt, real temptations to despair. And so I think it's important for us to allow for some personal experiences, again, not in a group therapy sort of a way, but so hopefully none of this sounds like what I would say to a therapist, but I do want to give some sense of my own personal interest in Boethius because it's not purely academic. It is that, but it's not only that. Like Dante, who talks about the soul of the one who lies in Soldaro, whose body lies in Soldaro, I think of Boethius as a living person, not as the dead author of some book that happens to be interesting to me. Indeed, when I'm in the habit, as I should be, but sometimes fall out of, I pray every day for the intercession of Boethius over my son, who's named after him. My oldest son is named Severin, after Boethius. And so we invoke his prayers for our son, again, ideally every night. So I think of Boethius as a real person who you can actually, in a certain sense, sort of communicate with. Why did I name my son after Boethius? I told his godfather about a decade ago that I couldn't think of anyone else I would rather name my son after. And why is that? Well, because he changed my life. How? Well, like Dante said, by helping me see the world's deceits. At that point in time, I was late teens. I must have been somewhere between 18 and 20 when I first read the Consolation. I had political ambitions, and reading Boethius's sort of condemnation of those, or repudiation at least, of political ambition, seeing what happened to him with his political experience, sort of cured me of those interests in political things and converted me, you might say, from the political toward the philosophical or literary life. It was probably about a decade later that I joined the Catholic Church and had a different kind of conversion. But maybe Boethius had something to do with that too, not just the book, but the person. So I've been reading about Boethius for some 20 years. And for what it's worth on the academic side of things, his work was important and formed the philosophical basis of my dissertation, which considers Platonic aspects of the poetry of Chaucer and the Pearl Poet. And so the first chapter of my dissertation is all about Boethius. So I do have those academic interests, but I also have these more personal interests. The book really was a book that changed my life. I've taught Boethius before, but never an entire course just on Boethius. This is the first time I get to do an entire course just on Boethius. I have included selections from the Consolation in courses as diverse as the history of the English language, a course on dream visions that I taught, both at the undergraduate level, a graduate level course on argumentation that I taught just last fall, a course on narrative that I taught in a state penitentiary. That was a really interesting experience because I could ask them when Boethius says sort of shocking things like it's better to be imprisoned in one's body than in one's mind, if that made sense to them, or that it's better to be the victim of a crime than the perpetrator, if that made sense to them. And they said in both cases that it did. And I can say more about that perhaps when those moments come up in the text. But all that to say, I've been doing fairly serious academic work with Boethius for about a decade. I'm not a classicist, though. My Latin's okay. I will usually, I don't have it sitting in front of me right now, but usually I'll have the lobe facing pages, Latin and English, so I can look at a Latin word perhaps and maybe make some sense of a passage that's tricky when we get to those things a couple weeks from now. But I really am more of a medieval scholar, more someone who does Middle English stuff, like I said, Chaucer and the Pearl Poet for my dissertation. But Boethius is such an influence that I've done a lot academically with him as well. All that to say, like I said, I've had, some couple decades of experience with Boethius. Somehow it wasn't until last year, which as I've noted is a 1500th anniversary year, that I actually took seriously one of the first things that Boethius says, which is that we'll see in a moment when we look at that opening poem. He talks about unfeigned tears, that this is a real horror that he's living through, and he really needs consolation. I kind of assumed for a long time that surely this person who had been studying Plato and Aristotle and so on his whole life, this wise man, this philosopher, that he himself, he didn't really need the consolation that he says he needs when he's facing death, that he was really already ready for that. But he realized that in this kind of situation, other people would need that kind of consolation. So he wrote the book sort of for them. I'm not sure why that was my assumption. Maybe it had something to do with wishing that that would be the case, because as a academic, maybe then I could sort of imagine that I was prepared for whatever life would throw at me. But last year, and actually I guess the experiences of the past, say, 18 months or so, have kind of disabused me of that view. And so forgive me as I just give a few personal examples of the sort of craziness my life has been like, and why I found myself in that anniversary year sort of communing with Boethius in a different sort of a way. In June of 2023, my family and I moved across the country in a kind of self-imposed exile, gave up my academic position so we could try our hands at homesteading. Ultimately, we want to integrate academic and agrarian things. But as soon as we got to the first property we were going to be renting, we found ourselves with basically a con man for a landlord, and had to move out a few months later to a different property where we've had all sorts of different issues, including as soon as we got there, pretty much one of our sheep died. Our livestock guardian dog that was very expensive got hit by a car and got killed. And we had these sorts of unnerving experiences. And then the trickiest one of all was around Easter, actually, I guess during Lent, really. We started learning more and more that our fifth child, who was in my wife's womb at the time, had a heart issue. And so on Easter Wednesday, just a few days after Easter Sunday, we drove down to the biggest hospital where such things can be taken care of near us, and found out exactly how our son was going to need not one, not two, but three open heart surgeries of the first 2 years of his life. That was what our June through October basically looked like, the first two surgeries. He's fine now. If you didn't know that he'd had surgeries, you couldn't tell until you see the scars all over his little chest. Everything else about him looks great. He seems like a healthy baby. But my wife was living away from the family for basically a solid month, more than that, this summer. And we had to watch our newborn son get wheeled back in to have heart surgery and such. Those were tough times, right? And it was in that experience of some of those despairs, the temptations to despair, the doubts, the sort of crisis of faith that comes with that, that I found myself thinking, no, Boethius himself, no matter how well he might have been philosophically prepared for this, when the thing actually happened, when he was actually imprisoned, he really probably was tempted to despair, and so on and so forth. And so I started taking that much more seriously. And there's this image in the constellation of the Wheel of Fortune. And the idea is that sometimes you're on top and things are good, and sometimes you're being crushed by that wheel. And over the past year, there were times that I felt like I was being crushed by this Wheel of Fortune, right? And so I realized that, yes, Boethius, even though he knew about the vicissitudes of fortune, it still doesn't help just knowing about them when you're feeling that pain, right? Interestingly enough, I don't know that the content of the consolation, when I reread it last year with some former students, um, was itself consoling, but I think there was some consolation to be found in knowing that even Boethius, even this person who's much more wise and saintly than I, had struggled with these sorts of things, made me feel maybe less guilty about my doubts or my sort of, but again, temptations to despair and such. I didn't specifically seek out the consolation for consolation at that time. I did, however, reread, after probably a decade of not having looked at it, C.S. Lewis's Grief Observed, which is a similar sort of a text where he struggles, philosophical though he may be, holy though he may be, with this death of his wife and all that it sort of entails. And so I think there's something to be, I found some consolation in knowing that even these great men, much better than I, had struggled with these sorts of things. Now, hopefully none of you are going through some, life crisis where you're being tempted to despair or anything like that. But if you are, well, Boethius is a good example of someone who also went through that. And even if you're not, like I said, there are other interesting academic things here too that I have enjoyed thinking about for decades. And again, don't want to get too personal here or anything like that, but I did want you to think about the ways that this text can be more of a devotional kind of a text. It can be a very serious attempt to come to terms with difficulties like the Odyssey, like the problem of evil. And it's also an interesting text to look at the poetry. If you happen to know Latin very well, I don't know Latin enough to appreciate the variety of the poetry, but you can read about how the lyrics in the Consolation span all sorts of meters and forms and styles. So you can read this text in all sorts of ways, more devotionally, more academically, more literarily. So I propose we just dive right in and we do some reading together and talking together about these opening lines. Again, it's a little unusual of a text because you start with a poem and then you move to prose. And not a whole lot of texts to do that. There are some others, if you've done a little bit of pre-reading and some introductory materials or something. Walsh mentions, for instance, The Marriage of Philology and Mercury, Capella's book on the liberal arts. That's a pretty dense, slow read. I've done it. It's a slog. I think I skipped some stuff, but it does some of this as well. The poetry and prose interacting, and it's a form called Menippean satire, and as the name suggests, oftentimes was used for satirical purposes to make fun of things. That doesn't seem to be the way that Boethius is using it, but uh, again, it's an unusual form. Something kind of like it shows up. Speaking of Dante, he has one of the earlier books of his, La Vita Nuova, The New Life, is alternating prose and verse. But in that case, it's him writing sonnets and then sort of explaining them in prose. So it's a little different because that's not how the Consolation works. If anything, the Consolation, the poems sort of explain the prose in a way. But all that to say, um, I'll just read the first poem and we can start talking about it. So this is what you just call Book One, Song One. And it's an interesting one because I think we don't really know what's going on yet, right? It's an interesting poem to read because we don't have a lot of background to it. We just sort of get dropped into it. I, who with zest penned songs in happier days, must now with grief embark on sombre lays. Sad verses flood my cheeks with tears unfeigned. The muses who inspire me are blood-stained, yet they at least were not deterred by dread. They still attend me on the path I tread. I gloried in them in my youthful spate, and sad old age they now console my fate. My woes have caused old age's sudden speed. Additional years my sorrow has decreed. White hairs upon my crown untimely came, and trembling wrinkles sag on my spent frame. Death finds no welcome in contented life, but is oft summoned when distress is rife. Alas, death turns deaf ears to my sad cries, and cruel will not close my weeping eyes. While fickle fortune transient goods did show, one bitter hour could almost bring me low. Now she's put on her clouded, treacherous gaze, my impious life spins out unwonted days. Why did you harp, my friends, on my renown? My steps were insecure. I tumbled down. Depending on what translation you're looking at, the poetry could look very different. How someone chooses to translate this poetry is going to depend on all sorts of things. One of the things that's interesting about this poem is when you get to the part about his sad old age. He's probably early 40s, right? He's not that old. And no, just in case anybody thinks this, people in the 500s did not all die when they were 40. He could have very well lived to be as old as anyone lives today. And so it's a little funny when he talks about how old he is, but then he explains that he's old before his time. Is it Roberto then? Is that what you go by? Did you have a question or comment?
Thank you. Yeah, I've heard that before that he was pretty young, and what one commentator said 30s, I think, and it's like really, I mean, he had two sons who were, consuls or some really high honorific position. Maybe they were that when they were 18. I don't know, but that I had assumed he was, his 50s anyway. I don't know if it matters. But
Yeah, so Walsh suggests that in his introduction suggests that his boys, when they were made consuls, must have been barely out of their teens, that they must have been early 20s or something. Which I mean, uh, apparently that was rather young at the time. He even suggests maybe that was a kind of way of intentionally that it was done to honor Boethius. Boethius, as he notes, gets to uh, compose and recite a poem in honor of Theodoric at that installation ceremony, basically. And so there may be a way in which they sort of were given those titles, which were at the time kind of ceremonial and not actually sort of politically meaningful. Um, Something more like, I guess, the British monarchy today or something like this, that, largely a ceremonial role, maybe some political influence or something, but not like voting members of a cabinet or something. That's as I understand it. Again, I'm not actually a classicist. So they wouldn't necessarily have been expected to be leading Rome or something like this, because indeed Rome is being led by Theodoric. Um, but yeah, they would have been quite young. And if that happens shortly before, I don't remember the exact year that happens, but I think it does happen fairly shortly before he's exiled. So if he's early 20s when he has his sons, and they're close in the same age, I'm not sure if, I don't think they're twins, but they must be close to the same age, then he could be, 44, 46, depending on, some people apparently think he, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy introduction, it might have actually been 526 when he was executed. That's not something I'd really noticed before. 524 is the standard date people give. But if he was indeed born in 480, as I'm not entirely sure why we have that date, then he would have been mid 40s when he died. So maybe the 480 date has some room for correction, but by all accounts, even by the standards of the time, he was still a young man. And so the white hairs is a little interesting that he mentions. Um, was he really gray-headed, or was this a sign of the stress that he's going through? But he also talks about the wrinkles sagging on his spent frame, or that's where you're wondering, like, really, you're getting wrinkled already? But who knows? Again, it's the imagery, I suppose. Other comments or thoughts about the poem, just on the surface, or things that stand out to you?
It seems interesting to me that he both seems to lament the sudden age that has come upon him with his exile, but is also seemingly ticked off that death hasn't come for him yet. It's like, I feel old, I'm looking old, but the sweet release of death has not found me. And he seems to begrudge that a little bit at the beginning.
Yeah, again, this is one of the things where you do wonder, like, does he really want to die? Surely he doesn't really want to die. Although we often, I think all of us have said these sorts of things. Oh, I just wish I would die already. Like I'm sure everyone has thought or said this, hopefully not too seriously. But it is an interesting thing, right? On the one hand, he feels old, but on the other hand, he's not old enough to die of old age, for instance. And so death gives him all the pains of age, but without the chance of being relieved of those pains yet. Other thoughts about this opening poem?
Yeah,
Yes.
I think there's a comparison here between his evident waning in physical health and his statement about his muse still being with him and leading him and inspiring him. So he is in poor physical health, but wonderful mental health. But the physicality of his slow decline, or his decay, is gives death a longing for him, which seems to be in contrast to his sense of having his muse still operative.
Yeah, his mental state's an interesting one, as we'll see here soon. He will, I guess it's really philosophy, but it'll be said that he's sick. And that sickness is a sickness of soul more than a sickness of body. But yeah, the relationship between the body and the soul here is going to be an interesting thing to continue to think about throughout the Consolation. I think Elizabeth and Madeline, had some.
Yes, I wanted to just make a point of telling you that, like, I have the book, the Ignatius Critical Edition, and really the reading of the poem seems to me very different. I mean, this basically the same ideas, but the language is totally different.
Yeah, that's just the nature of translation, and translating poetry is particularly tricky. I confess I don't have a copy of that particular edition. It's one that I've known about but never grabbed a copy of. But you know, when we look at some of the people that Boethius influenced, it will be nice to show you as well some of the translations of certain poems, perhaps into English. Um, I was mentioning to Larissa and Kathleen, we were talking about this course a bit, the issue of translation. I was hoping that everyone would have a translation that at least shows you poetry when there's supposed to be poetry, even if it's not great poetry, even if the rhymes aren't wonderful. At least if you remember this is a poem, this is a song, I think that's a good thing, because some translations are entirely prose. Interestingly enough, there are some Middle English translations, and I think also some around 16th century, if I'm remembering correctly, that are entirely verse, that even the prose sections have been translated into verse. So there are some translations of the Consolation that are entirely in poetry, some that are entirely in prose, and then there are some that try to imitate that back and forth, what's called prosometron, or this Menippean satire, both prose and verse. But the poetry in particular is going to be difficult to translate in a lot of ways. And so you might have some variations in how people decide to do that. And so that's part of where the preference of the translation comes in. It's obviously great if it can sound good poetically, but not all translations will be equal in that respect, to be sure.
I actually think it's very beautiful.
Good. I hope so. Yeah, I hope you can appreciate, even in a translation, the beautiful imagery that will come up in the poetry. Will have a lot of mythological language, natural imagery. He'll talk about animals at different times. The poems in particular will be opportunities for him to bring in all sorts of interesting things. So I hope you can enjoy the imagery and the sound. Madeline, you had something?
I was just noticing actually completely the opposite of that he had a sound mental state. I think anyone who is bent more in the melancholy distribution of faculties, I really understand this. He's just sad, you know. He's already too old for the world, even if he isn't really. You know, he feels like he's at the end of his life, even though he is all that young. And so my dad is one of these people too. I know a lot, just that they do age before their time, and you're like, what? And they often tend to be very, very poetic people. And so it's a very familiar idea, just to kind of be part of the group that ages quickly, I think, especially with the just the need to kind of have something to show for it, for all the grief that you carry in your own mind.
Yeah, I think there are a couple different ways we could think about what it would mean to be in good sort of mental health, so to speak. On the one hand, there's the intellectual acuity, right? The ability to be writing poetry, or to be reading complex philosophical works, or to be recalling to his mind things that he's read. Walsh makes some comments in the introduction to the translation I recommended, wondering something, I guess, about what Boethius' imprisonment looked like. You know, how many books did he have around him, for instance? He seems to think that Boethius must have had, you know, a certain number of books around him to be able to write all this. As a matter of fact, whether Boethius himself is such a person, I don't know that I have any proof for, but I think it would be hard to doubt. Some of you may know that scholarly types in the past memorized a ton. Michael could correct me perhaps on this, but I'm under the impression that many Jewish men during the time of Christ had effectively the entire Old Testament memorized. I'm under the impression that there are certain universities, rabbinical sort of trainings that basically still expect this today. From what I understand, many Islamic scholars would have had the Quran memorized in the Middle Ages, for instance. Similarly, I think the Vedas in those traditions as well. And there's a whole book, for what it's worth, on the art of, I think, the Book of Memory, who the author's name is escaping me at the moment. But all about
It's Mary Carruthers. I was just
thank
looking
you,
to put that in the
Carruthers.
chat because it transformed my entire view of how they understood literacy before the modern age.
Right. Yeah, we get
there was Francis
another.
Yates also.
Sorry, what's that?
I think there is also Francis Yates, which has a book called The Art of Memory.
Oh, I'm not aware of that one, so that's great. Yeah, so the Carruthers, at least, I've not actually finished her book, but I have gotten into some of it. She talks a lot about how somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas, who's been mentioned before, would have done his reading. And she's convincing that somebody like St. Thomas would go to a library, spend some time there, and leave the books there, and they would be in his head, pretty much. There's some good evidence that some of St. Augustine's sermons, she cites on at least a few occasions. We have sermons where apparently the deacon read the wrong gospel, and so Augustine had prepared a sermon for the correct reading for the day, but because he didn't want to confuse people, and I guess didn't want to throw the deacon under the bus or something, just like changed, and he like says something like, "Oh, well, I'm gonna have to talk about this gospel now," and then he just does a sermon, apparently with no preparation whatsoever, quoting different other church fathers, well, like what we would now call church fathers, or other sort of, I guess, commentaries on scripture, just entirely from memory. Again, on a topic he wasn't prepared to talk about, in theory. So it's entirely possible, I think, that Boethius could have written this with no books near him, because he could have what he needed in his head. Now, maybe he did have books. That's not really important, but my point here is simply that his intellectual abilities are clearly good, clearly very, very good, even as he's facing his death. So in that sense, his mental health is fine, right? He's not facing dementia or something like this. But as Madeline points out, his emotional health is another matter, as we'll see. Again, unfeigned tears. We should take those seriously. Other comments on the poem that begins this book?
I just noticed the word console in line 8, and that stuck out to me because of the title, I guess. Trying to figure out who is consoling him, I guess. The muses console him now?
Yeah, well, maybe we should go ahead. I don't want to cut off discussion of the poem, but maybe I should go ahead and read the first prose as well, for those of you who aren't familiar, because the question of the muses becomes very interesting. What exactly their sort of status is, what his relationship with them is or should be. And indeed, the relationship between philosophy and poetry comes up here in really interesting ways. So if you've read some Plato, for instance, or if you've done some just general reading in classical sorts of things, particularly philosophical texts, you probably know that there's sort of a quote unquote war between philosophy and poetry. That kind of question comes up in interesting ways here. So let's see what that looks like. These were the silent reflections. That's an interesting translation. Be worth looking at the Latin, because it sure seems like he's singing, right? He's talking about penning songs, and yet these are silent reflections. So he's singing to himself, I guess, which I nursed in my heart. My dutiful pen was putting the last touches to my tearful lament when a lady seemed to position herself above my head. She was most awe-inspiring to look at, for her glowing eyes penetrated more powerfully than those of ordinary folk, and a tireless energy was reflected in her heightened color. At the same time, she was so advanced in years that she could not possibly be regarded as a contemporary. Her height was hard to determine, for it varied. At one moment, she confined herself to normal human dimensions, but at another, the crown of her head seemed to strike the heavens. And when she raised it still higher, it even broke through the sky, frustrating the gaze of those who observed her. Her robe was made from imperishable material and was sewn with delicate workmanship from the finest thread. She had woven it with her own hands, as I later heard from her own lips. But because it had not been brushed up for so long, a film of dust covered it, like those ancestral statues that are grimy with smoke. At the lower edge of the robe was visible an embroidery, the letter pi, and the neck of the garment bore the letter theta. Between them could be seen the depiction of a ladder whose rungs allowed ascent from the lower letter to the higher. But the robe had been ripped by the violent hands of certain individuals who had torn off such parts as each could seize. In her right hand she carried some books, and in her left a scepter. Her eyes lit on the muses of poetry, who were standing by my couch, furnishing words to articulate my grief. For a moment she showed irritation. She frowned, and fire flashed from her eyes. Who, she asked, has allowed these harlots of the stage to approach this sick man? Not only do they afford no remedies to relieve his pains, but their succulent poisons intensify them. These ladies with their thorns of emotions choke the life from the fruitful harvest of reason. They do not expel the disease from men's eyes, but merely inure them to its presence. If you muses were up to your usual game of seducing some non-initiate by your blandishments, I should find it less objectionable, for my own work would not suffer. But this man must not be seduced, for he has been nurtured on the learning of the Eleatics and of the Academy. Off with you, you sirens! Your charms entice men to their destruction. Leave him to be tended and healed with the help of the muses that attend me. At this rebuke, the band of muses rather gloomily trained their gaze upon the ground, and blushes proclaimed their shame as they dejectedly left the chamber. My eyes were suffused and blinded with tears. I could not identify this woman who wielded such imperious authority. I was struck dumb, and with downcast eyes I began silently to wait her next course of action. Then she drew nearer and sat at the foot of my couch. She gazed on my face, which was heavy with grief, and bowed to the ground with sorrow, and she lamented my distress of mind in these lines. So just to be clear, she's about to sing a poem, a song of herself. So it's a very interesting moment because this woman who will later come to be called Lady Philosophy steps in and quite violently dispels the muses of poetry and wants to replace them with her muses, whatever that means, and then sings a song. So it's not exactly that she doesn't like poems, but what exactly is happening is a little trickier to say. Thoughts on the opening poem and prose together now, and particularly this prose section, how that might affect the way we understand what's going on here. Yi?
Well, one thing that strikes me now, right at the beginning, is that he describes the lady as exactly the opposite of himself, because he was between these two opposites of, okay, I am old, but I am longing for death. Death doesn't come for me, and so on. And this lady seems much older than him, because it's impossible for her to be from the same time. But she is strong, as he's not. And the word I have here, I have an English translation, but I also have a Portuguese one too, to get a better idea. And the words in Portuguese are quite strong about this: vivid colors, and an exhausting force and strength, and so on. So she has the more age than him, but some force that he lacks somehow and for some reason. And another thing that caught my attention is the description of the aspect and the dress. There is on my list an article from someone called "The Dress of Philosophy" in Boethius Consolation. I haven't read this yet, but I think it might be very interesting. It reminds me of Capella's "The Wedding of Mercury and Philology," because every character comes with a different dress and different different people around them, and everything has a symbolical meaning. This is something that, of course, maybe there could be a full course only on this description of philosophy here.
Those are great comments. Yeah, I like particularly the contrast between him and her. That's really helpful. That on the one hand, he's young but seems old. She's old but seems young, etc. Right. And yeah, the clothing is quite interesting. Just one quick point would be that the pi and the theta there are generally understood to be something kind of like practical philosophy and more theoretical philosophy, effectively. And so she sort of contains them both, or kind of fills out both of them, I suppose. But then a lot can be said about the tearing of the clothes as well, which comes up again later for what it's worth. But yeah, the clothing's definitely worth thinking about, and we could talk about it more tonight too. Whatever you want to discuss, we can discuss. Madeline says in the comment that the description of the clothing seems like it's out of Proverbs. Again, next week we'll get to talk a little bit about some of the biblical influences here. I think it's pretty clear. Indeed, one of the poems in the Consolation is very clearly alluding to, drawing upon, even sort of translating one of the chapters of the Book of Wisdom, or the Wisdom of Solomon. Or this is the one that used to be called Ecclesiasticus, right? But these sort of biblical ideas, particularly of lady wisdom, certainly are relevant here. So other
It's interesting that she calls them harlots of the stage when discussing the muses. So my background being what it is, I really love Byzantine history, Eastern Roman history, and this is not that distant from the time of, right, Justinian and Procopius and Empress Theodora, who is famously an actress, which is a profession of ill repute in early Christianity in this time. And so the alignment of the muses with poetry, but also the artistry of stage performance, and sort of the inability of that to cure you of your grief, but only make you willing to sit in it almost, that she claims, I thought was really fascinating. And I'm curious if there's maybe more behind that.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Byzantine things, but it is definitely a good thing to bring to bear, because one of the things that Boethius is accused of is trying to conspire against Theodoric with Constantinople to overthrow this occupation effectively. And indeed, shortly after Boethius' death, something like that effectively happens. And so, yeah, bringing to bear that kind of Eastern sensibilities and questions is certainly relevant. And I think, like I said, there's this sort of old war between philosophy and poetry. I think there's a similarly perennial question about the role of the stage and the theater in the life of the community, especially Christian communities. Michael, when we first met, he and I think he was I was sitting in on a class that was on medieval drama, in fact. And this is a real question. A lot of early medieval plays took place either in or just outside of the church. And there's a real question whether that's okay, or when is it okay. A lot of the early medieval plays are passion plays of some sort or another. They're sort of participatory enactments, oftentimes in monasteries, of like the resurrection, the passion of the resurrection. I think it's what's the word? The Quo Vadis. It's not Quo Vadis. Is that right? No, what is it? Quem Quaeritus. The Quem Quaeritus plays. Who seekest thou? So when the women go to the tomb of Jesus, and the angel is there, and they say, "Who do you seek?" Basically, who do you seek? Quem Quaeritus. There are a number of plays reenact that, and those plays might have been performed right in the middle of the church, maybe even like right before or after, during Mass in some way. But certainly by the time we get to Shakespeare's day, there are real questions about whether the theater is acceptable. And so, yeah, the idea that these muses are associated with theater is interesting. What would Boethius's view of the theater have been? Roman theater, for instance, the comedies in particular can be a little, raucous, and a lot of times slaves are main characters and things like this. It's kind of vulgar in a certain sense, not necessarily um, uh, morally questionable in terms of its content per se. Although, again, slaves, prostitutes, pimps are the kinds of people involved. The events that happen aren't necessarily risque, but Roman theater would have been, again, vulgar in some sense of the word. Madeline has another question or comment.
So she extols the Eleatics and the Academy, and in the notes of this one that you recommended, it mentions Zeno again. I've heard him mentioned quite a bit. Could you why is he important? I'm sorry.
So again, this is where I'm not a philosopher per se. It would also a little bit depend, I think, on which Zeno they're talking about, because there are a few different people named Zeno that are floating around in the introduction, I think, and in the notes. So you would want to pin down particularly who's being spoken about, because I think one Zeno is associated with with Constantinople at the time. I think actually one of the emperors is named Zeno. But then there's also the philosophical figure as well.
So I think this is the ancient Greek philosopher from the
Right.
5th century, Matt. I think that's what it's referring to in the
Go
notes.
ahead. Do you know more about? Do you have things you could say about Zeno? So I basically know the name, and I don't know a whole lot more, frankly. Again, this is where I'm a medieval literary guy more than anything else. So my dissertation's on Pearl and Chaucer, not on Greek philosophy. This is one of the things that you just have to confront about a text like Boethius. He's going to refer to a lot of stuff and a lot of people, and some of these are people that some people in the group will know about, and others are people that we won't necessarily know a whole lot about. Kind of like reading Dante. There are a lot of things that happen in Dante, some of which you want to go figure out exactly what he's saying, and sometimes you just think, okay, well, I don't necessarily know who he's referring to right now, or don't know a whole lot about that, but I can get the gist of what's going on and move forward. So you could do a lot with Zeno. You could go find more. I know there's stuff to be found out there. I can't say a whole lot about it. Does anybody in the group have particular insights into Zeno?
Well, if this is talking about Zeno, the Greek philosopher, he was one of the founders of dialectics, but in a different way, because he was more like discussing and showing impossibilities, let's say, logical impossibilities of proving the existence of change. And it was a discussion at the time, because if there is movement and change or not, and he was one of the first ones who tried to create some kind of persuasive and at the same time logical arguments about that. But I don't know exactly the context of the note, so I don't know if this is the guy.
Yes, that is the right person. That is the right person, I think.
Is
Go
this
ahead,
the Zeno's paradox with the arrow? Is that?
Yeah, the arrow, the race between Achilles and the tortoise, and so on. Zeno of
In the
Elea.
notes, it is the Zeno who founded the school. That's the one that is specifically mentioned. In the introduction, there were a few. It seems to be very popular.
Maybe it's this one, the founder of the Eleatic school.
For what it's worth, for our purposes, or well, if you have interest in Zeno, by all means, pursue it, right? But for a sort of especially introductory sort of reading of Boethius, what he's ultimately going to do here, and in the conversation between Boethius and later philosophy, what's going to become clear is none of these individual schools of philosophy, not the academics, not the skeptics, not the cynics, not the Eleatics, not the Stoics, not the who he mentioned specifically. I'm trying to think. The word is escaping me, but it'll come to me. None of these groups have the whole thing. So we'll get to this in another bit here soon. I think it's still in book 1 coming up, where he again talks about that clothing that's been ripped up. What later philosophy will later say is All of these individual sort of schools of philosophy have a piece of my garment. They don't have me. They don't have the whole thing. And so generally speaking, what Boethius is doing is critiquing these different schools as being incomplete. And that's probably one of the big things to keep in mind. In this particular context, for what it's worth, though, it does seem like what most bothers lady philosophy is that Boethius is someone who's trained. He knows these things, the Eleatics and the academics. He's not an untrained person. And that's what most bothers her. And so he's someone who's been through these sort of educational programs. He knows his stuff. And yet, even he who knows his stuff, like I was saying earlier, is falling victim to despair and doubt in his tears. Other comments or questions about the prose and the poetry here? While people think about if they have other questions or comments, I'll make a few comments just about things that I think might be interesting or worth paying attention to here. Looking at the poem, we already talked about the age question. It might be, speaking of this poetry versus philosophy, the opening line's interesting. I who with zest pen songs in happier days. He's a poet. He's been a poet, apparently, even in the past. The fickle fortune. Fortune's going to become a very big concept and concern of Boethius is, like I said, the Wheel of Fortune, for instance, that image comes up quite a bit. Looking back into the prose, then, one thing that, at least in this translation, this line of her glowing eyes penetrated more powerfully than those of ordinary folk. That reminds me a great deal of a line in the Book of Wisdom, again, which you can read between now and next week. The variation in height, again, we talked about interesting things there. Knowing, as you will eventually in the text, it's very clear that she's Lady Philosophy. Part of what he's trying to say here, I think, is that philosophy can think about mundane matters and also the matters that pierce the heavens, right? And so her sort of varying height speaks to, I think, the ways in which philosophy is applicable to different levels of thought or question or what have you. For what it's worth, I wonder too whether this is an image that Milton's thinking of in Paradise Lost when the demons don't have any definite height. Not that the demons and Lady Philosophy are otherwise connected, although Milton does make fun of philosophical inquiry in Paradise Lost by saying that the demons do philosophize while they're in hell. But if you look at Paradise Lost, it's hard to know how big they are, the demons in hell there, because there's no sort of physical landscape around them. And so that's another thing that could be happening here with Lady Philosophy. She's not an earthly thing. Size is relative, of course, but if you don't actually fit in a space, like if you're not a physical being, then it's hard to give you a sense of size, to give that thing a sense of size when it's sort of out of its context. Talk about the violent hands ripping the garment. We'll only keep paying attention to that.
I wonder. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I like this image of again, I'd have to look at the Latin to see exactly how this comes out, but the thorns of emotion choking the life from the fruitful harvest of reason. That's an interesting agricultural metaphor. It's also one that's familiar to scripture, the idea of thorns growing up and choking the life out of a plant. Again, I mentioned, I think already, that he's seen as sick. She talks about not expelling the disease from men's minds, but merely inuring them to its presence. This imagery of sickness and of her sort of nursing him is going to become important. Indeed, that's what she's doing when she sits down on his couch. She's like a nurse. She's like a mom sitting down with her sick kid who's got fever or something, right? There's this very maternal imagery at the end of this prose section. Also, quickly, just the sirens, her seeing the muses as sirens, all sorts of interesting imagery can come up with sirens. There will be indeed other poems that will invoke the sirens later on. That's all I suppose I want to say at the moment. Michael, what else did you want to say?
The imagery of her clothes being once fine but now dilapidated, covered in dust, torn by hands. You know, this is an era where the church has become increasingly suspicious of Hellenic learning. Within a couple of years of his death, Justinian's going to close the academy permanently in Athens. And I wonder if even 5 or 6 years before, in some sense, he's starting to feel that pressure where, like you said, even some of that Greco-Roman science knowledge is being sort of cast as magic or superstition. And I wonder if that's part of the disarray of philosophy and lady philosophy is sort of the darkening in their age of the acceptance of those traditions that he's going to preserve in a lot of his writings outside of this and in this as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Again, I'm not personally able to speak too much to the question of the church's view of say Greek learning at this time. It's a vexed question at different times. Certainly, the what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem question, for instance. Walsh suggests in his introduction that it seems pretty obvious that Boethius and his friends are not the types to be worried about these things, but that this is a worry that happens. I think the more perennial question that we'll see come up here is that Boethius realizes that philosophy is often in sort of all times and places derided or sort of questioned as a sort of dangerous thing. I mean, he's going to specifically refer to, the execution of Socrates, for instance, or to Nero and Seneca, I think it is, right? And these sorts of philosophical figures who've been outcast or who've been exiled or who've been indeed even executed. He thinks of himself in Ciceronian terms, as Walsh clearly kind of outlines, and Cicero was also exiled at different times for his more political philosophy. And then, like Cicero, Boethius understands himself as someone who is bringing to his own time and place this thing that might be harder for people to understand if they're not well educated. It's the way he's a popularizer. He's trying to take Plato and Aristotle in Greek, which not everybody knows, even in 5th, 6th century Rome, and is trying to make them available in Latin. And as Walsh points out, and I think the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article I mentioned points out, had he not done that, in fact, there would not have been a great deal of knowledge of these authors throughout the entirety of the Middle Ages. That Christian Western audiences in the Middle Ages were largely working with Latin translations of a handful of Platonic and Aristotelian texts, many of which were preserved by Islamic scholars during that time. So it's interesting that Boethius is trying to sort of bring this knowledge that's sort of foreign or erudite to a sort of more wide and somewhat more popular audience, perhaps. I think Walsh talks about a couple different logical works that Boethius wrote where he himself says this one's a little simpler and this one's a little more complicated, something like this, right? So he's trying to sort of adapt himself to different audiences and make these things a little more available than maybe they otherwise would be. And indeed, his doing so, like I said, makes these texts available for 1,000 years when they wouldn't have been otherwise. Other thoughts about these particular lines, whether the poetry or the prose? One thing that I was thinking about when Michael first talked about the stage, and then I thought about it again when I was looking at these lines, and should probably mention, if you're familiar with Aristotle's Poetics, the discussion of catharsis there, right? And so there's this interesting line here that maybe is thinking about that. They do not expel the disease from men's minds, but merely inure them to its presence, right? Catharsis is literally like a vomiting. And so these muses actually are not letting you expel these horrible things from your body. They're actually just keeping them in there. And so what she's trying to do is to get him to get rid of this stuff that's making him sick, not to just keep chewing on it, so to speak. Any other questions about Boethius, whether from these passages or other things we've talked about, themes that he is going to take up, or his personal life as we know it, or his place in the tradition?
I have a question. So what I'm learning with medievalism specifically is it all comes back to Dante, like everything, all of it, all the time. And I'm getting to be very annoying to my friends and family because I'm like, oh yeah, and then Dante says this too, and I'm all the time. Does Boethius end up being like that, to where, you know, he's so interwoven into classic understanding that it kind of always comes back to this book, that it's so foundational?
I mean, I would say so. I mean, even to your point, that Dante is someone that everybody seems to know and have read and be thinking about ever after he writes the Commedia. Dante himself thinks of himself in Boethian terms. He very explicitly casts himself in Boethian terms, which again we'll talk about this, you know, at the end of the course. But in the Convivio, which is one of Dante's other works, he's I think that's the one where he specifically alludes to Boethius as someone who's too little read, and he sees himself as imitating the Consolation in that text. And then there's some very real similarities in the life of Boethius and Dante, both exiled to a place that they did not want to be. Obviously, they're both Italians. They're both exiled for both political and religious reasons. Dante is, if you know anything about Dante, you know that he's got some problems with some sitting popes, or recent and or sitting popes. Some very real problems that are politically motivated, but have these sort of religious implications. But Dante's own personal life, he's bothered by the recognition that he's gone astray. You know, there's this interesting moment at the end of at least this translation of this first song, "My impious life." What is that supposed to mean? Again, that's something I'd want to look at in the Latin. Is he really saying that he's been sinful? In what way has he been sinful? Or, you know, what does he mean by impiety here? In what way has his life been impious? Is it, you know, again, it would be worth looking at the Latin, but, you know, is there a suggestion here that Boethius made some mistakes that he's sort of paying for? I don't know. But yeah, so Dante himself is thinking of himself as a sort of figure of a Boethian figure. Chaucer translates the Boesse, as he calls it. He translates the Consolation of Philosophy. So does Jean de Meun, who's the most famous sort of French medieval author. He writes the Romance of the Rose. And I think in Jean de Meun's translation, he says something like, you know, or no, it's not in his translation. I think John de Meun refers to Boethius, maybe even in the Romance of the Rose, and says somebody should translate this thing, and then he does it. And then Chaucer, I think, is actually aware of Jean de Meun's translation when he's writing his own. So effectively, the most important medieval French poet and the most important medieval English poet, Chaucer's called the father of English poetry. They both translate the Consolation of Philosophy. King Alfred the Great, who's associated with the Old English, well, basically all the Christian learning in the Anglo-Saxon times, Old English language. He at least commissions and maybe is involved himself in a translation of Boethius. Queen Elizabeth I translates the Consolation of Philosophy in her spare time, which is sort of odd. So you have literally kings and queens of England thinking this is an important enough text to translate perhaps themselves, certainly in Elizabeth's case, and perhaps in King Alfred's case as well. And again, some of the most important poets of the Middle Ages translating and or imitating Boethius. Again, Chaucer, John de Meun, Dante. English, French, and Italian poets, probably the top ones, and they're all imitating or translating Boethius. So yeah, he's big literarily for sure. And like I said, I think Thomas Aquinas quotes him about as much as anybody as well. Other comments or questions?
It was an interesting point about always coming back to Dante, because Pope Benedict XV, 1921, wrote an encyclical on Dante where he points him back to not just sacred scripture in the church, but St. Thomas Aquinas, back to philosophy, how Dante is basically a literary form of the philosophical thought of the church. So you have that tie of the literary back to the philosophical as its foundation to begin with.
Yeah, like I said, one of the things that's interesting about Boethius, but also about the whole of the Western intellectual tradition is this relationship between philosophy and poetry. And in somebody like Dante, you see them come together. This isn't a class on Dante, but what I like to tell people about Dante is it's interesting that he has La Vita Nuova, which is all about poetry, and he has the Convivio, which is all about philosophy. Those would only be read if we only read those because of the Commedia, right? Like nobody would care about those if Dante had read the Commedia. The Commedia is kind of like the marriage of those two things, right? He doesn't even finish the Convivio. So Dante sort of tries poetry by itself. He sort of tries philosophy by itself, but what he ultimately succeeds at is kind of marrying them, right? I think Chaucer's also a very philosophical poet for what it's worth. So really, and I mean, Plato is writing effectively plays and poetry, right? He's writing dialogues. The course that Dr. Papadopoulos led for the Magnus Institute on Plato's Republic makes this point that you need to read Plato's dialogues for their literary form and pay attention to little things like sighs and nods of heads and things like this, and pay attention to who the interlocutors are. These aren't random people. There's just not like, character A, B, and C. The names of these characters matter. They're real people that have historical identities, and knowing who they are and what they do in history is important. So somewhat similarly with the Consolation, we have this sort of marriage of philosophy and poetry, and paying attention to those things, I think, will be important. Other questions about Boethius at this point?
Something I read was that philosophy itself wasn't studied at the time of Boethius, and that like he brought about like this, like it wasn't its own it wasn't its own subject. It was just part of the other subjects that were studied.
Yeah, this is where, again, I'm not an expert on exactly what's being taught, when, where, and how, etc. But he does seem to see himself as someone who's rehabilitating learning in some way, that he does seem to think of, Walsh even quotes a couple passages from Boethius about texts that are not the Consolation. Let me just pull them up here if I can find them quickly. Yeah, so on Roman numeral page 21 in the introduction to the Walsh translation, he quotes two different lines, or two different passages from Boethius. One where he sees him as imitating Cicero, or sort of saying similar things to Cicero, where he says, though the duties of my consular office hinder my devoting all my leisure and full attention to these studies. This is actually on Roman numeral page 20. It seems nonetheless appropriate to any commitment toward the state to instruct the citizens in the learning of a subject over which one has burnt the midnight oil. The virtue of men of old consigned dominion and rule over cities to this state alone, that is, Rome became a ruler of other places. So I shall not deserve badly of my fellow citizens if I at any rate perform the remaining task of schooling the manners of our state in the arts of Greek wisdom. So even this is not superfluous to the duty of a consul, for it was always the way of Romans to lend by imitation more and more honor to all that was fine and praiseworthy throughout the world. So he sees himself as carrying on a sort of storied Roman tradition of bringing Greek things and other good things from other cultures, and making them prominent and perfecting them. This is somewhat tangential, but I think it's in Mary Wise Bauer, I think is the name. She has a book on the ancient world, and I think she's the one that talks about the Romans being really good at perfecting things. They aren't good at actually inventing things themselves, but they're good at perfecting things. So apparently when Rome and Carthage were especially at enmity, a Carthaginian ship crashed on some Italian shore, and the Romans found it, and they sort of reverse engineered it. And they went from basically not having a navy to having a navy that was better than Carthage's in like a year. Like they couldn't invent a good boat themselves, but once they saw one, they knew how to make lots of them very quickly and very good. And so there's something similar here in philosophical things. The Romans are often seen as sort of merely copying Greek things, but they saw something that they thought was good and they applied it to their own time, etc. we'll see next week, or as we start wrapping things up here, some selections both from Plato's Republic and Cicero's Republic, and then Macrobius's commentary on the Dream of Scipio, which is part of Cicero's Republic. We only have parts of Cicero's Republic because the only way we have it is from fragments that have been preserved in other texts and through a fascinating thing called palimpsest, where people have scraped off. At some point, somebody took a copy of Cicero's Republic, scratched off the ink, and wrote something else on it. And now through, like, I'm not entirely sure what kinds of magic of infrared and lasers and so on and so forth, we can see those old texts. And so a lot of what we have of Cicero's Republic is actually from texts that the manuscripts where it was erased and something else is written in its place. But we still have the Dream of Scipio, the final part of Cicero's Republic, largely because of Macrobius's commentary on the Dream of Scipio. And he begins that commentary by comparing Plato's Republic and Cicero's Republic. And he says that he and his son were talking about this. He says, my son and I were talking about these two things, and we realized that Plato, his Republic's all about this sort of mystical, universal state, that this kind of, the city and speech, right? Whereas Cicero's Republic's about Rome. So the Greek is this sort of universal, not very practical or applied or physically located thing. And then the Roman philosophy is more applied and particularized. And that's a sort of general truth, speaking in broad terms, about Greek philosophy versus Roman philosophy. The Roman philosophy is very political. It's very civics oriented. It's a lot of ethics. This is part of why it's probably not as often taught, as people find it somewhat less philosophical or somehow less interesting. It seems sort of less pure philosophy because it's sort of mired in politics and virtue ethics and things like this. But Boethius sees himself as someone who's doing this long-standing Roman tradition of taking a good thing that you find somewhere else and making it your own and applying it to your own people in your own time. Indeed, I'll sort of close by looking at this other quotation that Walsh includes. It is my firm intention, Boethius says, to translate into Latin every work of Aristotle that comes into my hands, and to write Latin commentaries on all of them. Thus I shall translate in due order all the elements of subtlety, of logic, of serious moral insight, of the keen vision of natural truth which Aristotle has penned. In addition, I shall provide Latin dress for all Plato's dialogues, by translating and also writing commentaries on them. On completing these tasks, I shall not disdain to reconcile, so to say, the ideas of Plato and Aristotle, and to demonstrate that the two do not disagree in all matters, as most critics hold, but that they accord with each other on most issues, these being the most important in philosophy. So he lays out this goal of translating all of Aristotle and all of Plato and showing that they're not that different. Really big goal, unfortunately cut short by Theodoric's executing him. I can't remember who it is, but I've read somewhere or heard somebody say, of all the people who had to die young, it's this guy who wants to do this, right? Wants to translate all of Aristotle, all of Plato. And had he succeeded in this task, and that if we'd actually had in the year 530 or something like this, or maybe by 550 or something when he would have died, if we actually would have had Latin translations of all of Aristotle and all of Plato, in the Latin West, what would that have done to the Middle Ages, right? How would they have been different is an interesting question. That his career being cut short, changes the course of history, perhaps intellectual history at least. Okay, with that, we're at our time. If anybody has any final thoughts, questions, or concerns, by all means, you can raise them. But I'll also just mention, like I said, for next week, hopefully we can dip into some of the influences on Boethius. I suggested you don't necessarily have to understand these things robustly in their own rights. I'm just giving you selections some of which I already had on hand for other courses. But I just want you to get some sense of these other texts that Boethius is thinking about, again, to place them in a tradition and to get us thinking about some of these ideas, and again, some of the forms, the ways that these are written, the kinds of characters, so to speak, or the dialogue form, or again, poems or prose or poetic or more philosophical. What I gave you for Plato is the dream of, or the myth of not the dream, sorry, the myth of where Ur falls asleep and or so dies, but then comes back to life and had this vision during death. And then the dream of Scipio is a similar thing in Cicero, but it's a dream this time, not a sort of afterlife experience. And there's a way in which what Boethius is doing is something similar, a kind of a dream. You know, this woman, he mentions being, you know, upset and sad, and he's in bed apparently, and this woman appears. So there's a sort of dreamlike quality, perhaps, what he's experiencing here too. So some of these even formal questions, but also the questions of content, the philosophical questions in these texts are worth thinking about, and hopefully we can have some interesting discussion about them next week. So again, if any of you have any other questions, thoughts, comments, raise them now. Otherwise, we'll talk about some of the influences on Boethius in a week.